There are moments in life that refuse to be explained, not because they are loud or dramatic, but because they leave you feeling something you can't quite put into words. Maybe you felt it standing on a cliff as a whale surfaces below. Maybe it's watching a flock of birds move through as if they're sharing a single heartbeat. Or maybe it's locking eyes with a wild animal for just a moment, realising that they don't know your name, they don't care what you do for a living, and yet somehow they leave a mark on you that lasts forever. I've always believed that some of life's great privileges aren't found in the things we own or the places that we go. They're found in those fleeting moments where nature quietly lets us in. Not because we've earned it, but because for a moment our worlds happen to overlap. Sometimes those encounters are peaceful, sometimes they're humbling, and sometimes they involve a rather oversized teenager with absolutely no regard for personal space, traffic rules, or garden landscaping. Today's story begins there, but where it ends is somewhere far bigger. Because behind every headline, every viral video, and every laugh is an animal with a story that stretches thousands of kilometres, dives deeper than most of us can imagine, and reminds us that the wild still has the power to stop us in our tracks. And I think we need that now more than ever. Welcome to If These Trees Could Talk. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are recording today, the Awabakal people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. As this conversation takes us across Bass Strait to the shores of Tasmania and onto the Southern Ocean, we also acknowledge the Palawa people, whose enduring connection to sea country stretches back thousands of generations. This episode is a reminder that long before science gave names to migration routes, breeding colonies and ecosystems, First Nations people were living with, observing, and caring for sky, water, and country as a connected whole. May this conversation encourage us all to look a little more closely, tread a little more gently, and remember that wherever we are, we exist in a place that has always been home to others, both people and wildlife.
What we need is to understand that we have a privilege to see an extraordinary animal. We still don't have all the information we need to be effective in managing their environment. So Neil is a great ambassador, I guess, to stimulate and get people to think about these things. All the things that Neil is doing is perfectly normal for an elephant seal. Unfortunately, Neil doesn't have friends to do it with. I don't think the consequences for Neil would be great.
Every now and then, nature gives us a moment that reminds us we are not the only ones who belong here. For me, those moments are everything. Now, if you have listened to this podcast for a while, you will know that genuine encounters with wild animals rank right at the top of my moments I live for list. Well, with one exception, which is eastern brown snakes, especially when they're trapped in my bathroom with me. I have shared stories about hearing whales before I could see them, getting lost looking for lyrebirds, and being ridiculously protective over little penguins. I believe the greatest wildlife encounters are the ones where we leave the animals exactly as we found them. Wild. A couple of years ago, we were travelling through Portland in Victoria when we stumbled across an elephant seal named Sammy. Unlike today's subject, Sammy was exceptionally well behaved. He was simply lying on the beach, resting, scratching, yawning, having a thoroughly lovely time doing absolutely nothing. And I remember thinking I might have just found my spirit animal. So I sat down on a rock where I felt it was safe and I watched him. For the next hour or so, I did nothing. No selfie, no trying to get in his face, no need to interfere. I simply had the privilege of sharing a tiny moment in this world and snapping a few gorgeous photos from a respectful distance. As I walked back to the car afterwards, I cried. Not a little, "Oh, that was beautiful" sniffle. I mean ugly cried. Sobbing, snot, the whole lot. The boys absolutely lost it laughing at me, not because anything extraordinary had happened, but for me, it felt that way, because somehow sharing space with this ancient wild animal felt like a gift, one of those rare moments that reminds you just how extraordinary our natural world really is. Then, not long afterwards, Australia fell in love with another elephant seal, Neil. And if you have somehow escaped this phenomenon, Neil is a young elephant seal who has become one of the country's most unexpected celebrities. He's slept in the middle of roads, climbed onto cars, flattened garden beds and fences, taken over boat ramps, and generally behaved exactly as you'd expect from a teenage elephant seal weighing close to a ton. He is hilarious, he's chaotic, and he has captured the hearts of millions. But underneath every viral video is an animal with an extraordinary story. Southern elephant seals are the largest seals on Earth. Adult males can weigh several tons. They dive to depths of more than 2,000 metres, can be underwater for around 2 hours, and spend months alone in the vast Southern Ocean before returning to land. They live lives that are quite literally beyond our imagination. The more I watched Neil's story unfold, the more questions I had. Why is he here? Is this normal behaviour? What does all of this attention mean for him? And how do we celebrate a wild animal without changing the very thing that makes them so special? So I thought if I really wanted to understand Neil, there was one person that I needed to talk to. Dr Clive McMahon has spent more than 3 decades studying the oceans and the remarkable animals that call them home. He was very recently awarded the Australian Antarctic Medal for his outstanding contribution to Antarctic and Southern Ocean science. His work has taken him from Australia's coastline to some of the most remote places on Earth, including Antarctica and the sub-Antarctic islands, where he's dedicated his career to understanding how elephant seals live, breed, migrate, and survive in one of the harshest environments on this planet. His research has also changed the way we understand our oceans. By fitting elephant seals with satellite tags, Dr. McMahon and his colleagues have gathered vital information from parts of the Southern Ocean that are almost impossible for scientists to reach, helping us better understand ocean health, climate change, and the hidden world beneath the waves. Quite simply, there are few people on Earth who know these animals better. So today, we're talking about Australia's most rambunctious teenager, the incredible life of the southern elephant seal, what Neil is teaching us about living alongside wildlife, and why sometimes the more science explains, the more extraordinary nature becomes. Dr. Clive McMahon, thank you for joining me today.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's always a pleasure to talk about elephant seals. Thanks, Shannon.
Before we dive into Australia's most rambunctious teenager, would you like to let our listeners know how you got to be in this position where you spend so much time working alongside of these animals?
Sure, I've been really lucky that I started my Antarctic career quite early on in my life. So I am originally from South Africa, where I had the privilege to go down to Marine Island way back in 1988 as part of a team to remove the cats from the island. And essentially, that was the start of my long Antarctic career. Essentially, I'd fallen in love with, I guess, the southern lands, the weather, the climate, the animals were just something that really spoke to me, and it's been a lifelong passion / vocation ever since.
I have listened to you speak about working closely with the elephant seals and what a huge impact they have been able to have on your ability to research in ways that haven't been done before.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we're in a really fortunate position where elephant seals are obviously large animals, and they're able to carry these miniaturized oceanographic instruments that our colleagues at the Sea Mammal Research Unit in Scotland developed. And these instruments measure critical parts of the ocean that are really not not accessible using conventional systems, so ships or Argo floats, for example. Now, the instrument actually measures temperature, conductivity, and depth, and it has a clock in it. And this allows us to reconstruct what the seals are doing at sea, but it also allows us to do things like measure what the Global Ocean Observing System calls essential ocean variables. And these are things like temperature and salinity. And this is central to us understanding how much heat is in the ocean, what the water column looks like, and what the processes are in the Antarctic. So the Antarctic is especially important for global climate because this is where the Antarctic dense water is formed. And this heavier water that's formed when the water freezes, the salt is extruded, creates essentially a waterfall off the Antarctic shelf. And then this drives the currents around the world. So, I've said it many times now. For me, Antarctica and the formation of this dense water is really the beating heart of the globe. And the elephant seals have been instrumental in helping us identify spots where dense water is formed and also allowed us to quantify how much of this dense water is being formed. And what we know, not just from elephant seal work, but from all the work around Antarctica, is that there's been essentially a freshening of the waters around Antarctica from melting ice shelves and glaciers. And this is resulting in a general freshening, which means that there's weaker formation of dense water. In other words, what's happening is that we're reducing the capacity for dense water to drive the currents. And if we were being or using a comparison, what we're doing is it's kind of like constricting your heart. So your heart is not as able to pump as strongly and as consistently as you would like. If that continues, in humans, it results in heart attacks. The resulting climate/global effect remains a little bit unknown, but what we do know is that it'll change our globe profoundly.
This speaks to part of the reason why I wanted to have this conversation today, because when we have an elephant seal that is so prominent everywhere at the moment, I have friends in the US who are seeing him on their local news. Now is a really wonderful time to talk about some of these things because the research that you're doing, which is incredibly important, not just for now, but going into the future, it gives us an opportunity to highlight some of this with the interest around Neil and him showing up in Tasmania. I think I'll ask the question that everybody wants to know, and one that I was really curious to learn about. Why Tasmania?
So I guess there's a few things wrapped up in your question there. And I guess the first thing to address really is that southern elephant seals used to breed in Tasmania in the past. So there was a very big and a thriving colony on King Island. And of course, that changed when humans were introduced into the system. And we're quite voracious. So we essentially killed all the animals for their oil, which is not a great thing. So elephant seals are perfectly capable of living happily in southern Australia, essentially, but in particular in and around Tasmania. Now, how Neil got to be here was a little bit of a fluke on one level because it's not common for elephant seals to breed in Tasmania at the moment. There's a small number that are born irregularly at Macquarie Island, and every now and again a young female probably gets caught short while she's out feeding and then returns to the nearest beach that she can. And that's essentially what's happened to Neil's mum, is she's probably been caught short, arrived on a beach on the Tasman Peninsula, and then given birth to Neil. And I think this was in 2020 that he was born. So he's 5.5 years old now. So it's not common, but we do see elephant seals fairly regularly around Tasmania. We've also seen elephant seals in Victoria fairly regularly. And in fact, one of them has been carrying a mark from a long-term demographic study at Macquarie Island. And that animal is a female that we know is almost 25 years old. So this does happen. The animals breed very irregularly. There's no consistent breeding activity. But we do see animals turning up to molt. And molting is something that's obligatory for elephant seals, and they have to return to land to do it because their molt is catastrophic. And that means that they lose both their skin and their hair, which is replaced during that time. And they have to be ashore to do that. So the animals we generally see in Tasmania or in southern Australia are animals that are turning up to molt. And this is a stressful time for them because it's energetically expensive to replace all of your skin and hair in one go. You and I are doing it every day, and so we don't really notice it. But the elephant seals do it in one go. And when they're doing it, they're not feeding. So probably for up to 6 weeks, the animals are ashore without food, doing something that's energetically very expensive. So there's a lot of incentive to give the animals the space they need during that time to be peaceful and do their thing. I think that's the bottom line with a lot of this stuff, is that we have this extraordinary privilege to see a magnificent animal like an elephant seal in Tasmania now with Neil, but also others that have turned up in Victoria and South Australia and even Western Australia. So, we just need to recognize that these are wild animals, give them the respect they deserve, enjoy seeing them, of course, and use seeing them to inspire us to learn more about the animals in the first instance, but then also what is it that these animals need. And that's where I think we can start learning more about what's important in the Southern Ocean. And when we start learning about the Southern Ocean, we realize that it's central to all of the globe. And we learn about how important it is for our weather in the short term, but also for our climate in the longer term. So Neil is a great ambassador, I guess, to stimulate and get people to think about these things. But in seeing and enjoying the presence of Neil, we do need to be respectful and understand that he is a wild animal. And wild animals deserve respect. And part of that respect is not invading their space. We don't like it when people invade our space. Animals don't like it when we invade their space. So it's just a question of respect.
You're talking about Neil's age there. He is still quite large, and I think that's a big reason why people are drawn to him, even at that young age. Can we talk a little bit about the sexual dimorphism between the males and the females, and maybe lean into a little bit about some of Neil's behaviour that we're seeing with him attacking traffic cones and bollards, because it is playing into exactly what he should be doing at this stage of his life. Even though most people are looking at it as a comical thing, it's an important part of his development.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Shannon. All the things that Neil is doing is perfectly normal for an elephant seal. Unfortunately, Neil doesn't have friends to do it with. So normally he would be sparring and fighting with his conspecifics, so elephant seals of a similar age and size. And they need to do this to hone their skills for when they are beach masters or potentially become beach masters. And that's the master of a harem. And to do that, they need to be big and strong. So the reason there is this big difference in size in elephant seals is that they have this breeding system, which is a polygynous breeding system. So you have one male that services many, many females. And to do that, you have to be big and strong. And so what's happened is size has been selected for in males, but not so much in females, so that only the biggest and strongest males end up being the beach masters, in other words, holding the harems and then having access to mating with all the females. So Neil now has really sort of switched from being a relatively containable type size seal to one where he's now starting to change quite rapidly in his adolescence, developing towards being a big beach master one day. Unfortunately for Neil, because there are no breeding spots or sites in Tasmania, it's unlikely that he's going to hold a harem. But I think we all want to keep our fingers crossed that hopefully he turns up at Macquarie Island when it's the breeding season, so in September and October, or by some fluke he manages to get back to Macquarie Island. However, having said that, Neil, of course, doesn't know other elephant seals, so it'll come as a bit of a shock when the thing that you're sparring against suddenly starts sparring back. So that'll be a quick lesson for Neil in, I guess, the real elephant seal world. But all of his behaviors are what we see at Macquarie Island or Herd Island or any of the breeding colonies, or the haul-out sites, where they are sparring with one another, they jostling, they're snoozing together, they're doing everything he's been doing is normal elephant seal behavior. It's just in a slightly abnormal setting, and that is a setting where humans have stuff. And that stuff we value, but I think, some damage to that stuff is a small price to pay to have access and see a magnificent beast like Neil in our midst.
You mentioned that they come ashore while they're having their catastrophic molt. What would Neil's life look like outside of that time where he is hauled up on a beach going through that process?
So I just want to be clear. So what Neil was doing now was not molting. The molting season is in December, January, and February is when elephant seals molt. There is something called the mid-year haul-out, which is what Neil was doing. And that is that the animals come ashore to rest, and especially for the young males, spar and develop some of their social behaviors. So that's what Neil was doing. Neil was here as part of a mid-year haul-out. That time he would normally be interacting with, other male elephant seals, sleeping, resting, sparring, jostling around in the shallow waters, basically having a nice time and having a nice social time. Because normally when elephant seals are at sea, they're alone. So they spend about 85 to 90% of their lives at sea feeding. And most of that time they spend underwater in the deep ocean finding the fish and squid that they need to grow. So an elephant seal has a pretty tough life when it's out at sea because it dives constantly, sometimes to 2,000 meters, and it feeds on fish and squid, like I said, and it just does this in a very metronomic way. So there's not a lot of resting at sea. We don't see them resting for long periods at the surface. What we do see is them constantly diving, looking for and capturing food.
So, just to give people an idea, the 2,000-metre depth, we're talking about them diving to the same level as, say, whales?
Elephant seals dive much deeper than most whales. And certainly much, much deeper than any of the baleen whales. So the baleen whales, they still dive very deeply, but they don't dive as deeply as elephant seals. The animals that do dive as deeply as elephant seals and even deeper are the toothed whales, the beaked whales. So we know that some of the beaked whales are diving probably below 2,000 meters. What they're feeding on there is a little bit of a mystery, but it's probably these really deep water squid and really high energetic fish that live in those depths. But it's very difficult to, of course, study animals at these depths because it's tough on instrumentation. It's tough to attach things to animals, especially the beaked whales that are generally quite rare. We don't see them very often. And then, of course, often you might need to recover that instrumentation to get your data back. However, like our elephant seal tags, the CTDs, the conductivity temperature depth instruments, they transmit data in real time through a satellite constellation. And the satellite constellation we use is Argos. It's run primarily, it's organized and run by the French Space Agency, and it's been the cornerstone of data transmission, especially from remote areas of the ocean. So I think there are a lot of questions that remain in understanding how our ecosystem functions and then how each of the individual bits of it operate and then interact with other bits. So
Mm.
we know quite a lot about elephant seals. There's still lots more to learn. We know less about beaked whales. We know a bit more about the baleen whales. We know probably very, very little, or in fact nothing, about the very deep-dwelling fish and squid and sharks.
Not all of our elephant seal populations are coping equally. I've heard you talk about the colony on Macquarie Island and the fact that it has been declining at a steady rate over decades. I don't know if many Australians would understand that elephant seals are actually listed as vulnerable. Can you explain to us what's happening there and why those numbers are declining?
So there's a couple of things going on. You're absolutely right that our work at Macquarie Island, I've been lucky to be involved in it for 30 odd years. But what we have access to is a time series that extends to over 70 years. And in that 70-year period, we have seen a consistent decrease in numbers every year, to the extent that we've now had a decrease of about 70% of the Macquarie Island population. And what we think is happening is that it's really about females accessing parts of the ocean and feeding well or not feeding well. And what we've been able to do from our tracking work at Macquarie Island is identify essentially 3 different strategies that the females use. So some of them feed sort of in the mid-latitudes of the Southern Ocean, some of them feed along the East Antarctic coast, and some others feed towards the Ross Sea. And the animals that are feeding along the King George coastline seem to be the ones that perform less well than the other ones. And what's happening there is, unlike much of Antarctica, the ice has been growing there. We're not sure whether it's good ice, in other words, ice formed from really good high salinity water, or whether it's ice that's being formed from fresher water that freezes at a higher temperature and then acts as an insulator. But what is happening is that seems to push the females that feed there off the shelf, which is their favorite feeding spot, and they perform less well. They produce smaller pups that have lower survival, and those lower survival then translates into lower recruitment for that proportion of the population. And when we include that in our models, we get a fairly representative decline or decrease in the numbers. So we think that that's what's happening. The reason elephant seals have recently been upgraded, their status has been upgraded to vulnerable, is because they've had a huge impact from the H5N1 avian influenza virus. And what's happened there is that many, many thousands, many tens of thousands of elephant seals have died from this virus. In South America, at South Georgia, at Heard Island very recently, we've seen reports of that. And to a lesser extent at some of the other breeding colonies, like the colony that we study at Cadgillan. And to date, we've been really lucky that H5N1 hasn't made its way to Macquarie Island. But we do know that it's now in Australia. We've seen it in Western Australia, we've seen it in South Australia, and we've even seen it in New South Wales.
Mm.
So the disease is moving around, and if it gets into the population of elephant seals at Macquarie Island, it's likely to also cause mass mortalities of the seals. So while there's not a lot we can do to prevent the virus coming in other than good biosecurity, being careful how we deal with things, knowing the behavior or the dynamics, the epidemiology of the disease does help us to look and say, where are places or where are there things that we can do? So for example, if seals were congregating in relatively small numbers at a haul-out site during the mid-year haul-out or at molting, we could theoretically vaccinate animals in those places because there are few animals. So it's easy to vaccinate 100 or 200 animals. It's nearly impossible to vaccinate 10,000 animals. So if we know where these sort of crossovers occur, we can identify those as sort of, I guess, priority sites for intervention. And what we then do is by vaccinating at one of these intervention sites, we break the transmission cycle or the transmission pathway. So knowing where animals go, how they mix, and what they're doing at sea and on land from the different colonies is a really important component of understanding how we might be able to mitigate against some of the worst effects. We can't stop the worst effects because if they happen, if the disease comes to Macquarie, it's very likely that many, many animals will die and that population will decrease even further. So how we prevent these things is we've got to stop them happening before they start. And those big things are really, really big questions that come down to how humans behave. We have to look at high density farming. We have to look at mixed farming practices, ducks and poultry. It's not such a great combination. It really does promote the movement of viruses between things. High densities mean it's easy for diseases to move on. We saw this in COVID, of course. That was the idea about getting people to stay at home, is that we try to artificially, or not artificially, we reduced the density, the connectivity of people and humans, and then you're breaking these transmission cycles. So those are big questions that we all need to think about, and we need to try and say, how can we best live our lives to reduce the reliance on high density farming?
Now that we understand a little bit more about the challenges that we're facing and the fact that Neil has become a little bit of a celebrity, I would love your input on how, as humans, if we are to come across Neil, which I know a lot of people are out looking for at the moment, or like me, that day in Portland when I come across Sammy on the beach there, I understand the fascination because I obviously experienced it. But how can we observe them while giving them the respect that they need?
I think the critical thing here is to recognize that, all animals are adapted, and they're very well adapted to some level of disturbance. Um, and this includes humans, of course, if we were so stressed by being disturbed, we'd all die. So we've evolved for dealing with some level of disturbance. Now, I'm not saying we should go out and disturb things. What I am saying is that if we maintain a respectful distance from an animal, they might look up and go, oh, look, there's a whole bunch of humans, but they're kind of far away. They're not in my space. There's no problem. I don't have to worry about that. But if we go to within the comfortable space for these animals, and it differs for different animals, of course, that's going to stir them up. And if we get too close, they will potentially lash out because they're trying to protect their space. They're not being malicious. They're not being vindictive. They're not actually being anything other than behaving like a normal animal, and in fact, how humans would behave. If you're walking down the street and someone comes and suddenly taps you on the shoulder, you don't react friendly to that behavior because they've invaded your space, and it's kind of like, what's going on here? I need to protect myself. So the seals are the same, and Neil is the same too. So for us, I think we need to recognize what a privilege it is to see a wild animal like a southern elephant seal in an accessible place like 7 Mile Beach here in Tasmania. And we should go out and we should look at Neil and we should enjoy the fact that we can see an animal like this. But we have the responsibility to say, how do we minimize the effect or the impact we have on that animal? And that's by following the simple rules that the management agencies put in place, because they've gone and they've looked at what is a reasonable distance to stay away or to stay from the animal. And when you're talking about a big elephant seal like Neil that weighs 1,000 kilograms, or in a few years' time when he might weigh 3,000 kilograms, you don't have to be on top of him to see him and enjoy him. You can do that probably very comfortably from 50 meters away. So do that, and do simple things like, take your pair of binoculars with you if you want to study him closer. We do that when we go bird watching. We don't try and climb a tree and pick a bird out of its nest all the time. We can do things, and we have the instruments that allow us to observe animals in a respectful way. And so it's really just about people, I guess, engaging with the process and saying, yeah, I don't need to have a selfie hugging Neil. Neil probably doesn't like that, the same way as if you went to some stranger and did the same thing. They wouldn't like that either. So why do it to Neil? Respect the fact that he is a wild animal and that he needs his space too.
Can we talk about what the consequences could be for Neil if, say, in that situation, someone who was trying to get a closer photo was injured or bitten by Neil? The consequences for him would be catastrophic.
I don't think the consequences for Neil would be great.
Hmm.
And it's really unfortunate because Neil would be paying the price for poor behavior, and poor behavior that we know that we can manage and we can change. So there's absolutely no reason for somebody to go up, try and take a selfie of themselves, or have a picture with their child or their dog or whatever it is next to Neil. None of us need that picture. What we need is to understand that we have a privilege to see an extraordinary animal in the wild, essentially, and we need to focus on that. Because unfortunately, if Neil does hurt somebody or kill somebody's dog, there are going to be consequences, and those could vary across a whole spectrum of management options. So we have the capacity to not even go there by being respectful and being careful around Neil, and in fact all wild animals. There's no need for us to go up, for example, and pick echidnas up, or climb trees and pat koalas, or any of these things. Enjoy the fact that you have these animals in your backyard, and treat and observe them from a respectful distance.
Given my own interaction with Sammy, it was such a special experience for me. And I think about you spending decades being around these animals. Do you ever stop experiencing that excitement?
Well, I think I'm really lucky, like I said, right from the start. I've been exposed to elephant seals for almost 40 years now. And every time I go south, it's like the first time for me almost. I love the place. I love the animals. Elephant seals are, I guess, for me, a very special animal. I've been studying them intensely for a very long time. And I just really enjoy, I guess I just really enjoy being around them. But more broadly, I really enjoy being around all of the animals in the subantarctic and Antarctic. So for me, it's just a wonderful privilege, and I hope it never gets old. But I think the evidence would suggest that it's not going to get old. And I think that's because every time I encounter elephant seals or wild animals in general, I'm learning something new about them. And that inspires me to be respectful, and it also inspires me to do the best I can to ensure that I'm not having any negative effect on those animals. Bearing in mind, of course, if we are catching elephant seals to attach our instruments, we do have to do stuff to them. We do have to give them an anesthetic to do that. But we can manage how we do that by being good at what we do, having standard procedures, being respectful around the animals when they're asleep, not making a noise, all of those things. But we can also use some chemical aids. So we can give the animals components that'll help them forget the experience so that they don't identify humans as bad things all the time. so that they can go away and live their natural lives, sort of unencumbered by the fact that we need knowledge from them to help conserve and understand how they use the environment. So conservation is a really big question, but it's really based in having good knowledge. And for lots of animals, and including elephant seals that we know a lot about, we still don't have all the information we need to be effective in managing their environment. And that's because their environment is big. And their environment is affected by things much bigger than short-term things. So climate change, of course, is a huge issue. And that's a collective thing that we all need to really look at addressing.
I know there'll be people listening who will finish this episode and want to dive deeper, whether it's into your work or organisations that you might recommend or other people who are doing great things in this space. Where would you encourage them to go to keep learning about elephant seals and supporting their conservation?
Well, I think there's a couple of really key players in this space. So, of course, people can go onto the known sites. So, all of the conservation departments have excellent bits and pieces about elephant seals. But there are some organisations that are a bit more dedicated to looking at wildlife, especially in the subantarctic. And the Macquarie Island Conservation Foundation is one of those. So they have an excellent app that tells you all about all of the animals, including elephant seals, which is a great thing. And they also support research in the subantarctic. And me and some colleagues, we've been lucky enough to win a grant from the Conservation Foundation, where we will specifically be looking at elephant seals. So there's a really nice piece on the conservation site about the work we do there. And of course, on the IMOS, and so the Integrated Marine Observing System that supports our work, and the Sydney Institute of Marine Science, who I work for, have blurbs on their websites about elephant seals and the work we're doing. Because often, I guess it's a little bit difficult to penetrate some of the scientific literature, although we do try and make it so that it's accessible to everybody through some of the podcasts that we're doing, like this one. The Antarctic podcast that I did a few months ago, I think it came out a few weeks ago, is a really nice, accessible way to learn about what's going on and why it's important that we understand elephant seals and how and why we need to understand their environment and how they are helping us do that. So the elephant seals are playing a key role as collaborators in this space. The same way, I'm going to switch completely to something different now, the same way that turtles are helping us do that in the Northern Territory. So we attach the same instruments to turtles in the Northern Territory to help us understand tropical cyclones and tropical storm formation. And those data, like the elephant seal data, are made available in real time, which means we can use it in forecasts. And those forecasts, when we use the turtle data, are improved greatly. That means we have a better way of forecasting the storms, better way of saving lives and saving livelihoods, because predicting and forecasting tropical storms is quite difficult. And that's because we have no information about the subsurface in the tropics. So this is where I think for us, it's a really unique and privileged position to be in, is where we're collaborating with our animal colleagues, in inverted commas, to do good things for the animals, understand their environment, help protect it, and good things for us, looking after our environment and being better able to understand our climate.
Thank you so much, Dr. McMahon, for taking the time out to join me today and for sharing a little bit of your knowledge around elephant seals and for doing the work that you are doing, not just for conservation of the animals and our earth, but for also helping to make those tricky things to understand accessible for the rest of us. We appreciate everything you're doing and I appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Well, thanks, Shannon, for the opportunity to talk about something that I really love doing and that I hope that I can continue doing for many years to come. That may not be the case, but we have some really brilliant young people coming through the system. And so hopefully in many years' time, they'll be the ones talking about the progress we've made and the difference we've made. So, this is a continuum, and I'm just very happy to be able to be part of something bigger and to help understand our environment and the wonderful and magnificent animals that live in it.
When I sat down to record this conversation, I thought it was going to be just about Neil, Australia's favourite troublemaker, the teenager climbing on cars, blocking traffic and keeping wildlife officers very, very busy. But somewhere along the way, I realised it wasn't really just about Neil at all. It was about what Neil represents. He reminded millions of Australians that we are incredibly lucky to share this country with animals that still have the freedom to be wild. Animals that don't exist for our entertainment, our photos, or our social media feeds. They simply exist, and what a privilege it is that sometimes our worlds overlap. Meeting Sammy in Portland is still one of the most profound wildlife encounters I have ever had. I didn't need to touch him. I didn't need to get closer. I just needed to be present. And I think that's what I'll take away from today's conversation. The more we understand these incredible animals, the greater our responsibility becomes to protect them. So the next time you see a story about Neil, or you're lucky enough to encounter an elephant seal yourself, I hope you will see more than a big, awkward lump of blubber causing chaos. I hope you'll see an animal that survived one of the harshest environments on Earth, travelled thousands of kilometres through the Southern Ocean, and trusted our coastline as a place to rest. Let's make sure it stays that way. A huge thank you to Dr Clive McMahon for sharing not only his knowledge, but decades of dedication to understanding and protecting these remarkable animals. If you've enjoyed today's episode, we'd love if you shared it with someone else who loves wildlife, or maybe with someone who only knows Neil from the videos online. Because every conversation that helps people better understand our natural world is another step towards protecting it.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode. If These Trees Could Talk and What Would They Say are productions of Bellevue Studio. Our host is Shannon Walters, executive and audio production by Megan Anderson, with socials and marketing managed by Mia Oberdorf. We always appreciate hearing your thoughts, so if you would like to support the show, you can rate, review and subscribe. To stay up to date between episodes, you can also find us on Instagram, Facebook and TikTok. For more information on this episode or to connect with our guests, you'll find everything you need to know in the show notes at ifthesetreescouldtalk.com.au. We're grateful to have you with us, and we look forward to sharing what comes next. Thanks for being here.